It happened in broad daylight, under a sky as crisp as the folded flags above Buckingham Palace, a place where silence speaks louder than sirens. A man, barely in his 20s, strolled up in designer sneakers, coffee in hand, and arrogance in his stride. Without warning, he flung the steaming drink at the chest of a royal guard, splattering the scarlet tunic, staining decades of tradition in a single reckless act. The crowd gasped. Children clutched their parents. A ripple of disbelief swept across the square. "Relax, it's just a joke," he called out, grinning, as if centuries of honor were his punchline. But the guard didn't flinch. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it would leave the world breathless. Because this time, respect had the final word. It was the kind of afternoon postcards are made for: clear skies, the faint scent of spring blossoms on the breeze, and a crowd gathered in quiet anticipation outside Buckingham Palace. The changing of the guard was minutes away. Cameras clicked. Children pointed at the tall bearskin hats. Tourists whispered with reverence, knowing they were watching something sacred, something that hadn't changed in generations. In the middle of it all stood Blake Cunningham, 24 years old, freshly styled, and live on 3 platforms at once. With bleached hair, a luxury hoodie, and a self-satisfied grin, he stood out like a shout in a library. His fans adored his antics, mocking accents in Italy, interrupting monks in Kyoto. This was just another country, another costume to laugh at. "Brits take this stuff way too seriously," he said into the camera, smirking. "Let's see if they've got a sense of humor." Across the courtyard, Lance Corporal James Whitmore stood as still as stone. 38 years old. Broad shoulders. Weathered face. A decade in uniform. He'd served 2 tours in Helmand Province. Been ambushed. Decorated. Broken and rebuilt. And yet, he'd never missed a single day of post since joining the Queen's Guard. To him, this wasn't performance. It was duty. Discipline. A way of honoring those who never made it home. Blake didn't see a man. He saw a statue. A challenge. A prop. He whispered something to his friend, who stood ready with a camera, and lifted the coffee cup, still nearly full. They laughed. Loud enough to draw glances, but not enough to raise alarm. Around them, the crowd swelled. A mother lifted her daughter onto her shoulders for a better view. A retired couple stood arm in arm, reminiscing about their own youth. A group of schoolchildren lined up along the railing, waving flags and wide-eyed. And in that delicate moment, where tradition met innocence, Blake chose spectacle over respect. He stepped forward. He lifted his arm. And tradition met arrogance. Blake swaggered forward, his every movement exaggerated for effect. He lifted his knees high like a toy soldier and swung his arms stiffly, parodying the centuries-old march with mockery written across his face. "Let's see how unshakable he really is," he muttered, eyes on the phone screen as hearts and laughing emojis fluttered up the livestream. In one hand, he held the paper coffee cup. In the other, his phone, broadcasting live to tens of thousands. His voice was cocky, rehearsed. "We're outside Buckingham Palace, and I'm about to test the famous British self-control." The Royal Guard didn't flinch. Lance Corporal James Whitmore stood as still as the stone beneath his boots, eyes locked forward, jaw clenched, rifle resting against his shoulder, every detail immaculate. His scarlet tunic caught the sun like a flag made of iron. Blake began circling, mock-marching around him, drawing eyes like a siren in a cathedral. Parents furrowed brows. A tour guide paused mid-sentence. A group of students lowered their phones, sensing something was off. The tension crackled. And then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, Blake hurled the coffee. The cup hit the guard's chest with a dull splat, the brown liquid exploding across the pristine red uniform. Gasps erupted. A woman near the front clapped her hands over her mouth. Children turned wide-eyed toward their parents. A toddler let out a startled wail. The smell of sugared cream rose into the air, sharp and offensive. Blake stepped back, arms raised like a magician after a trick. "Hey, it's just coffee. Don't be so serious," he laughed. His cameraman forced a chuckle, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. The old couple who had once stood smiling now stared in stunned disbelief. The woman shook her head. The man's jaw tightened. A boy, no older than 10, tugged his mother's sleeve. "Why did he do that?" he whispered. She had no answer. And still, the guard didn't move. Not a blink. Not a breath visible. Coffee dripped from the brass buttons of his tunic, gliding in slow, bitter trails toward the belt. His eyes, shadowed beneath the bearskin hat, remained forward, unwavering. The air grew still. Even the pigeons seemed to pause. In that silence, something older than any throne or flag seemed to rise, an invisible current of reverence, as if the very ground knew a line had been crossed. Blake laughed again. But this time, no one laughed with him. For a long moment, nothing moved, not the guard, not the crowd, not even Blake. The air felt thick, as if time itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, with a grace that seemed carved from granite, the royal guard took one deliberate step forward. His boots landed with quiet finality. Not a flinch. Not a rush. Just precision. Purpose. The crowd instinctively parted, a hush falling like snow. Phones lowered. Breath caught in chests. With practiced calm, the guard raised his gloved hand and reached for the small, gleaming ribbon on his chest, a silver medal, unassuming to most, but known by few to be the Operational Service Medal for Afghanistan. Earned, not given. Seen, not boasted about. He unpinned it. Held it for a moment. Then looked, not with anger, but with something far more piercing, toward Blake. Just the smallest turn of the head. Just enough to speak. And when he did, his voice was quiet. Even. But it rippled through the silence like thunder underwater. "That stain you've thrown," he said, nodding ever so slightly at his tunic, "is nothing compared to the blood of brothers I've stood beside." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The medal glinted in the sunlight, held steady between his white-gloved fingers. "This uniform isn't a costume," he continued. "It's a promise. Every thread of it stitched with sacrifice. Your joke, it dishes more than me. It mocks every man and woman who stood where I now stand, and didn't come home." A wave of stillness swept the square. There was no threat in his tone. No pride. Just truth. Heavy and immovable. A teacher in the front row, who had moments earlier been recording the scene for her class, lowered her phone with trembling hands. Tears spilled down her cheeks. A man in civilian clothes, standing off to the side with military posture, raised his hand and saluted. No words, just quiet respect. And Blake, once so loud, so smug, suddenly had nothing to say. His smirk vanished. His arms dropped. The coffee stunt, the views, the followers, none of it mattered now. In that moment, every soul in the square understood. This was never about a prank. It was about reverence. It was about the kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't strike, but simply endures. Because some men wear silence like armor, and in doing so, teach the world what honor truly looks like. The footage hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. Uploaded by a bystander less than 10 minutes after the incident, the video swept across platforms with the speed of outrage and/or combined. Within 12 hours, it had surpassed 1 million views. By morning, it was on every major news outlet from London to Los Angeles. Headlines blazed across screens. Influencer throws coffee on guard, gets schooled by silence. Royal Guard's poise goes viral, the words that shamed a generation. Strength in silence, the Royal Guard who spoke for the fallen. On Reddit, the clip found a second life. Veterans from across the Commonwealth gathered in the comments, sharing personal stories of discipline, of restraint, of watching friends fall and standing tall anyway. One user wrote, "My grandfather served in the Coldstream Guards. He never talked about war, but he taught us how to stand straight, how to hold our word. That guard? He reminded me why I was always proud." Educators took notice. Schools across the UK, and later abroad, played the video during assemblies. Some students sat in stunned silence. Others wiped their eyes. A headmaster in Manchester stood before a hall of teenagers and said simply, "This is what it means to serve without ego. Watch how strength doesn't need to shout." Twitter ignited. Hashtags spread like wildfire. #Guard of Dignity. #Respect the uniform. #Strength in silence. Public figures weighed in. actors, athletes, politicians. But it was a retired general's post that resonated most. The boy wanted attention. The guard gave him something far greater: perspective. Dignity doesn't demand applause. It earns it. Blake's world, once powered by views and viral clout, began to collapse in reverse. His comment section was no longer cheering. It was mourning the loss of decency in pursuit of content. One follower wrote, "You chased fame and ran into a man who didn't move." His inbox filled not with brand offers, but with severed ties. Sponsors issued statements. Collaborators deleted videos. Endorsements vanished overnight. But it wasn't just his platform that faltered. It was something deeper. The silence left behind by the guard had echoed into Blake himself. You could see it in the way he stopped posting. The way he turned off comments. The way his usually scheduled content was suddenly absent. Someone asked in a live stream replay thread, "Was it worth it?" No reply ever came. Because for the first time, Blake Cunningham didn't have a punchline. And maybe that was the beginning of something more meaningful than followers ever were. The backlash reached further than the internet. Within 48 hours, the British Ministry of Defence issued a formal statement. The Royal Guard represents the highest traditions of our military and national identity. We condemn all acts of provocation or disrespect toward those who serve with dignity and discipline. The statement was brief, but its tone was unmistakable. The act hadn't just crossed a line, it had struck a nerve. Lance Corporal James Whitmore, who had refused interviews and declined all public comment, was quietly summoned to Horse Guards parade the following week. Behind closed doors, in a small, solemn gathering of senior officers, he was awarded a commendation for conduct under provocation. He accepted it with the same stillness he had shown in front of the palace gates. Meanwhile, Blake Cunningham's descent into accountability began, not through social media, but through the justice system. He was charged formally with public misconduct, incitement, and defacement of military property. His legal team argued that it had all been performance art, a joke gone too far. But the judge's words cut through any pretense. "Your laughter," she said, looking directly at him, echoed at the expense of sacrifice. It mocked not a man, but a legacy. The court sentenced Blake to a £5,000 fine and 100 hours of community service. The specifics were no accident. He was assigned to clean war memorials, to assist veterans at a rehabilitation center, to listen to stories he could never undo, and sweep stones engraved with names he'd never earned the right to mock. His apology, when it came, surprised everyone. It wasn't a video. It wasn't Monetized. There were no cuts, no music, no hashtags. Just a few shaky words, spoken to a group of reporters gathered outside Wellington Barracks, where the guardsmen were stationed. "I didn't understand," Blake said, voice thin, hands in his pockets. "I do now." Some called it a PR stunt. Others, especially those who had served, watched closely, looking not for perfection, but for humility. But the moment that mattered most wasn't broadcast. It wasn't even meant to be seen. A tourist caught it by chance weeks later, just a blurry photo shared on a community forum. It showed Blake Cunningham, alone, walking up to the gates of Buckingham Palace. No camera. No entourage. In his hands, a small bouquet of red poppies. He knelt briefly, placed the flowers near the base of the fence, gave a small nod toward the post where Lance Corporal Whitmore had stood. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. The next morning, just as the bells chimed 10, Lance Corporal James Whitmore stepped back into position at his post outside Buckingham Palace. Uniform pristine. Boots polished to a mirror gleam. Chin lifted, eyes forward. The same man. The same stance. But now, something had changed around him. Children tugged their parents' sleeves and whispered, "That's him." Tourists still snapped photos, but the lens lingered longer, as if trying to capture not just an image, but the weight behind it. And some didn't take pictures at all. They simply stood and watched, quietly, as if attending something sacred. The young boy who had clutched his mother's hand during the incident? He later wrote a school essay that was passed from teacher to teacher, until it reached the head of the district. Its title: "True Strength Doesn't Shout." As for Blake Cunningham, the world saw fewer uploads. The pranks faded. The performances dulled. But one video stayed pinned to the top of his channel. It wasn't monetized. It didn't trend. Just Blake, sitting on a bench in silence, the sound of traffic in the background. After nearly a full minute, he said, softly, "The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more reverence." And that was all. The internet moves on quickly. Outrage fades. Algorithms shift. New controversies rise. But some moments, quiet, powerful, human, leave something behind. In a world obsessed with volume, it was silence that echoed. A silence born not of defeat, but of principle. Of standing still, when pushed. Of speaking truth, without raising a voice. Of honoring those who came before, with every breath you take on duty. And so now, perhaps the real question is not what the guard did, but what you would do. Have you ever witnessed strength so quiet, it shook the world?